is that theory has a reputation for being frankly unscientific, even anti-scientific. And this led to the so-called science wars. And this is where I'm going to start with this first part about language. The language of science is itself tremendously controversial. The person who gets to define what science means is a person who, by definition, needs its authority. And as a result, practicing natural scientists have an unjustified but socially undeniable power in determining what science means to the public mind. This is not a trivial point. This is where Foucault and other power analysts are exactly most relevant. A historian or a philosopher like me, even though I research and do research direction, including in the natural sciences, I'm not a practicing natural scientist. I'm a scientist in the German or French language, a Wissenschaftler in German, but we don't have that term in English. And so it'd be quite odd if I said I'm a philosophical scientist, although I'd have no problem saying that because I'm as much as a scientist as any mathematician or physicist. But in our language, we don't perceive that. It's not only challenged, it's hierarchically subordinated clearly as a value system. Science is higher than the humanities. So we have this apparent split. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this split, and I'm going to explore them in the course of the lecture, and I hope show you that the split is spurious at every level, but its social reality therefore becomes even more mysterious and requires an alternate explanation than the idea that there's two separate things called, for example, science and the humanities. I think that's utter nonsense. And yet the power of that distinction is extraordinary. So it seems ridiculous in one sense to say it's a nonsense distinction, but so is this distinction between science and religion. And this is the burden of my book, Becoming Human, Philosophy as Science and Religion from Plato to Posthumanism, which will come out from Columbia University Press in about a year. And what I'm describing in this lecture is going to be a précis to the public for the first time of some of the major results and perspectives that I develop at length in that book. And this particular orientation point is, what is science? And in the American sense, science is what scientists do, and scientists is what scientists say they do. Now, philosophers and historians have never accepted that. And therefore, if you're a serious scholar, you have to look at the history of the term science. And that is surprising. The history of the term science and the usage that we have, science as opposed to philosophy, science as distinct or opposed to religion, science as distinct or opposed to other studies like history, philosophy, cultural studies. This is an extremely novel usage. It derives from William Whewell, Whellell, a very brilliant 19th century Victorian, basically one of the founders of the philosophy and history of science, who wrote a major multi-volume work in which he essentially literally introduced the term science in the modern sense. Now, I'm going to discuss this briefly in a moment, why it's important that he did this. But the first thing is to just know there is no non-anachronistic use of the term science in our modern sense before the 19th century. This already offends scientists because they have their little stories that they learn, as Kuhn says, from textbooks, which is, some kind of potted history of the Dark Ages and then Newton and let there be light and all that stuff, when in point of fact, the history of science is much more rational in the sense of there's great developments throughout the whole history. There are revolutions, but the idea that the ancients were somehow scientifically illiterate or insignificant is simply preposterous. But it's part of the textbook idea of the history of science that Kuhn describes as necessary to the psychological formation of a modern natural scientist. So the first thing is therefore, okay, what is science? It's a novel term that's gained power because of the English language. It's not reflected in other European languages in its restrictive sense. So that's extremely important to establish so we know, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a historically contextualized origin in the 19th centuries of an overwhelmingly powerful concept in our culture. So Stephen Gaukroger, who sadly just passed away, but was a member of our Meanings of Science project, wrote the most important recent history of science. He wrote a 4-volume history of the origins of modern science for Oxford University Press, which is an extraordinary series that anyone really serious in the field, of course, has read or is reading. And Gaukroger's fundamental question that he develops in the first page of the first volume is to try to understand not only why science took on a distinctive shape in the West, because of course there's scientific traditions in Arab culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, but there is the valid historical question of why apparently around the 17th century, did science take on a very powerfully progressive new form, and particularly in the Western European world. And that is a very important historical question. Every great historian of science is interested in it, including Max Weber. Weber's opening to the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. In his preface, he says, the fundamental question of all social science is to determine the answer to the question of why social forms and institutions or thought forms of a, he says, universal significance arose in the West. Because Weber was perfectly well aware it was not because of some intellectual or ethical superiority. Other cultures were ethically in many ways superior or intellectually superior at many different points, like India or China, for example. So when you eliminate any chauvinism, you simply have a scientific question, which is of enormous historical importance. Why did science, in the way we think of it, emerge so recently and in such a specific historical context? And what does that say about its power in our culture today? So science then is the, as Gaukroger says, the governing cultural authority of our society. And therefore, the framework of his book is what he calls the origin of scientific civilization, because this is indeed one of his great contributions to the history of science as a field, is to clarify that we now know there's very rich scientific traditions with incredible innovations and insights in China, for example. Joseph Needham's multi-volume history is still the standard work on that. And Needham was attempting to answer the question, why did science take off the way it did in the West? Because he knew China has an extraordinary tradition of technological and intellectual development. So how come it didn't get to the so-called scientific revolution, say, first? Or would it have gotten there? So this is in a way the fundamental question of the history of science, but in a deeper sense of all historians who are scientific. Weber's not thought of as a historian of science, yet this question of literally why these distinctive, especially scientific institutions and life forms, why did they become civilizationally dominant in what we call the modern world? This is the great unifying question of basically historical, social, and scientific study, because it is the who are we question writ large about why is it that we have discovered how to measure to 11 decimal points the fundamental state of, say, the quantum vacuum or what's in a vacuum. This is an astonishing fact. It's a kind of precision that is utterly unprecedented and would never be obvious that humans could attain this, or that we could precisely calculate how to send an object hurtling through the air at hundreds of thousands of miles per hour and land perfectly on another astral body. So the fact that we can do this is because of what we broadly call science. So if humans have any divinity or superpower, apart from questions of gods, it's clearly this power, is that humans are the animals that can do physics and math. So science then, in the broadest sense, we have to recognize is knowledge and the processes by which it's pursued and attained. This is a non-anachronistic definition of science, which is my broad definition in my work in my book. Science is the pursuit of knowledge, the process of knowledge, and the results of knowledge when it's obtained. It's crucial to recognize the interlocking connection between these senses, but the senses used fallaciously. People say science. What do you mean? People say trust the science. What do you mean? Trust the results of science? Trust the process of science? Trust the development of science? Many scientific results are false. Obviously, that's how scientists figure things out, is they're professionally accustomed themselves to determining their own errors. That's in a way what makes a good scientist. So of course you shouldn't always trust scientific results, but you should trust the science. So what does that then mean? Obviously it must mean trust this process over other processes that will give you a knowledge claim with no foundation. Trust the process that we call science. That's an important distinction. And I think much of so-called science skepticism would immediately be eliminated if one could just be clear about the distinction between results and process. The process of science, I'll argue, and I argue, for example, my 7 lectures publicly on Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Evolution, the scientific process is, we will discover, I believe, in this century, the actual essence of what science is.